In the Torah portion of Vayeshev, we read the classic story of how Joseph incited his brothers to hate him by telling them stories of his dreams, how he dreamt of his supremacy over them and their subordination to him. And was this the right thing to do? We have many Torah commentators explain from many different perspectives whether Joseph was in the right or in the wrong. But interestingly, Rabbi Isaac Luria, 16th century Kabbalist, explains that Joseph was in the wrong. He actually taunted them unnecessarily. And as Kabbalists always explain that if we don't correct our mistakes in this life, we have to correct them in the next life. We have the doctrine of Gilgul, which means reincarnation. Into whom was Joseph reincarnated to correct, to achieve tikkun for this error of inciting his brothers? Says Rabbi Isaac Luria that the Talmudic sage, Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha, who was one of the 10 martyrs that we read about on the Yom Kippur, he was actually a Gilgul, a reincarnation of Joseph, of Yosef HaTzadik. And his martyrdom achieved tikkun, correction, for Joseph's earlier error. Now in chapter 38, we read this remarkable story of Judah and Tamar, which has been spoken about, expounded upon many, many times from many different angles. But the question that everyone wants to know is that Judah, of course, is the progenitor of the Messiah. The Messiah will be descended from Judah from this very strange union with Tamar, which occurred under such obscure circumstances. How is it that the Messiah, Mashiach, our righteous Redeemer, the pious tzaddik who is the archetype of perfection, how could he have emerged, even ancestrally, from such a salubrious union? So the Kabbalists explain that even though in Judaism, of course, we're a monotheistic faith, so we do not believe that evil has any independent power from God. We don't believe in a dualism of good and evil. Evil itself is a tool of the Almighty. But nevertheless, God created evil, and in the supernal realms, under His supervision and under His control, the forces of good and evil do wrestle with one another. Now when an extremely pious soul, an exceptional soul, is about to come down onto this earth, sometimes the forces of evil, the klipot, the demonic forces, do not consent. They refuse to allow it, and they kick up the greatest opposition that they can manage. And sometimes the defense lawyers, so to speak, for the pious soul, can only find a little loophole through which that soul might enter the earth. A pious soul sometimes enters the earth through very salubrious circumstances, because that's the only way we can get the forces of evil to agree to it. The demonic forces kick up such opposition that the concession, so to speak, is to let that soul or soul lineage enter through dubious fashion. Chapter 39, verse 6, we read that Joseph had handsome features and a beautiful complexion. Why does the Torah tell us this? Why is it important to know that Joseph was so beautiful? So the Kabbalists explain this again through the doctrine of Gilgul, of reincarnation. Joseph was a reincarnation of Enoch, of Chanoich. And Enoch was actually possessed a very high portion of Adam's soul. Adam was one of the most beautiful people who had ever lived. So being that Adam's soul lineage was somehow found in Joseph, the Torah points out to us that it wasn't just a soul comparison, it wasn't just a similarity of the spirit, but even their physical features, because of course the physical is always a reflection of the spiritual, even their physical features were comparable, and Joseph was very beautiful. And this idea comes up again when we have the rather teasing story of Joseph and Potiphar, how this righteous tzaddik escapes the clutches of this lady, the lady of the house, who is after him. Now the sages, the Jewish sages, relate that Joseph was actually very tempted to succumb to Potiphar's seduction. And in that classic moment, when she approaches him and says, "Sleep with me," the sages said that he was about to give in, except that he saw through the window the image of his father. And when he saw the image of his father, he managed to resist temptation. What is the point of this story? What is it telling us? So the Talmud says that Jacob, Joseph's father, actually had the beauty of Adam. He was a reincarnation of Adam, and he had the beauty of this illustrious soul. Joseph had to pass this test. If he just looked at it from the perspective of his own life, then, our own lives, we're sometimes willing to compromise for ourselves. But if you see your life in the context of the history of humanity, and the purpose of tikkun olam, of correcting the world, and the tikkun, the healing of your soul line, then Joseph realized that his entire life, his entire mission in life, was to correct the primordial sin of Adam, to reverse the errors that have been done in the past, and this was a historical opportunity. So seeing the image of Adam through the window was really a reminder of historical consciousness and the role of global tikkun, of spiritual healing, that we all have in our lives. Chapter 39, verse 12, we read, the story continues of Potiphar. She actually grabs Joseph. And the verse says that he dashed off and went outside, leaving his clothes in her hand. Well, what's the message here? Why is the Torah telling us that he left his clothes behind? So Rabbi Menachem Twersky, who was the Rebbe of Chernobyl, 18th century Hasidic Rebbe, gives a fascinating insight here which is relevant to us all. What are clothes? So Kabbalistically, your soul consists of a core element of the soul, and it also has clothing around it, a kind of wrapping around it. And what clothing represents metaphorically is the externalities of life. Our thoughts are considered to be, our fleeting thoughts are considered to be clothes of the soul. And kind of getting tied up in things that are not that important and losing focus of our inner being and inner purpose, that's really focusing on the clothes. Joseph used to curl his hair. He used to beautify himself. And that is why Potiphar, of course, sought him. She was attracted to him because he was so beautiful, and he'd worked on that. That mistake of getting trapped in externalities is a focus on your clothing, the clothing of your life. And therefore, in order to abandon Potiphar, Joseph had to leave his clothes behind. He had to say to himself, I was mistaken, I shouldn't have been curling myself on excessively, beautifying myself excessively. I put too much energy into the clothes. So says Rabbi Menachem Nachum, that leaving the clothes behind was not just his physical clothes, but his attitude to things less important, more superficial, more popular by nature, rather than more than addressing our inner being. Spiritual message for this week. Obviously, this Torah portion is filled with fascinating lessons for all of us. Here are a few. Number one, partiality. The whole problem of the friction between Joseph and his brothers arose because of Jacob's partiality to Joseph. We have to be so careful about that in our family lives, in our business lives, not to show unnecessary partiality that could evoke the jealousy of others. Number two, hatred. Look how the brothers hated their brother. And look what tragic consequences that led to. Hatred is so tempting. It just comes upon us because we're human and people anger us and we just start to hate them. It is so toxic. Hatred is the most toxic emotion. And if we would realize the cost of it, the human cost of it, we would steer clear from it, like the plague. And finally, of course, very basic spiritual messages this week. The lesson of Joseph. Resisting temptation. I mean, many people like to understand the story that he wasn't tempted at all, but I think that takes the human element out of it. We are all tempted to sin in our lives, and when we read this story again and again, we realize our spiritual heritage. We're all descendants of the patriarchs. Torah is empowering us to resist those damaging temptations and to live an upright, noble life. Thank you so much. Join us again next week for Torah in 10.